So today is, again, we're kind of turning the corner into getting started with the course material. And in some ways, you could say today is the first day of really getting into the material per se. For one, because this is the first day when I asked you to have read something from the two texts. I don't know. You remember what you're supposed to read?
First part of
yeah. Right. So chapter 1. You'll notice that I skipped the prologue, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't read it. That was what the editor decided to write himself. It's got sort of really broad background about how to think about the region. It's got some stuff about almost prehistoric lay of the land. And so I just decided that to talk about the background to Israel, it was really chapter 1 that would be the most immediately relevant. I sent you right there. And if you'll notice, again, I kept telling you that this is a book that is edited, so it's written by a set of different people. The guy who wrote chapter 1 is named Wayne Petard, a friend of mine, and who's a specialist more on the writing side than the archaeology side, a little bit like me. His dissertation was on ancient Damascus as a sort of central place in southern Syria, still a city that would have been in the news in the last several months. So a city with a lot of history. And so I think especially because he knew this sort of Syrian material well, then the editor asked him to handle this background to Israel because it takes you to Syria. And you'll see why in a little bit. Or you probably would have seen why somewhat just by reading the first half of that chapter. So we'll come back to Petard. But my goal today is to think about the background to Israel. I started with Meren Ptah and the very notion of how you can begin to talk about Israel in an earlier period in this land, and where you can start if you don't just assume the biblical story. And the reason for putting this Egyptian text out there was so that you would see that there is this really, really important, though short, piece of evidence for the existence of early Israel, already back in what would be called the Bronze Age, so the very, very end of it. So today, I'm going to try to get us thinking about what lies behind that. What lies behind the appearance of Israel in the land. I called the class Israel's Roots. And so I defined my goal for today's session to be to get you to see the landscape of this world into which Israel entered differently than you had. So I don't know what you bring to it. Some of you are thinking, I don't know anything. I have no preconceptions. I don't even know the Bible story. Anything you tell me is fine. Well, in that case, yeah, this will be different. But that aside, whether it's from the Bible or whether it's just from a sense of ancient history that you probably got in 6th grade when you studied Babylon and Hammurabi, we carry a kind of sense of the ancient past with us. More of us than we might admit. And I can almost guarantee you that whatever sense you bring to this class is probably not where I'm going to head. And so my goal is to get you to think about this in a very particular way that will make the background to Israel make sense. Now, my particular focus in getting you to think about this is twofold, I guess you could say, which is to get you thinking about shepherds and about nomads. So thinking about shepherds and nomads. And you'll see why as we go, although in a way, so the other thing I assigned for you today was a letter, if you caught that, right? So I hope you did get to it. This is a letter from a place called Mari. And if you weren't sure what Mari was, then that would be an advantage to having read Petard's article in Coogan, because he devotes 3 or 4 pages to this site and gives you kind of overview of its history and kings. Did you catch that? Or go ahead and tell me if you didn't, right? But there was a direct connection between the Petard section, the first half of that chapter, and the reading that we're doing as primary evidence. That this letter, sort of seems obscure letter, but between these two strange guys, comes from that site, which was the centerpiece in a way of that first part of Pittard's chapter in Coogan. Okay? And I wrote a book on this archive, just a slice out of it, because it's a huge, huge archive with a lot of implications for a lot of different questions. But in the process, it's an archive that I know pretty well, better than some things. And so out of that, it was easy for me to think about a text to choose. And the text that I chose was one that I'd worked on a little bit, and so at some point for a different class, I'd translated it. The translation that you're reading is mine. So it's not a text that's ever been translated into English otherwise. So all this said, I'm going to start with a thesis. And I took a little bit of time to think about how I should word this thesis, and I'm sure it's not the best way. But I do want this to be what you take away from this class session. And I'm going to read it to you at the beginning, I'm going to repeat it to you somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to repeat it to you at the end, just so you really you see what I'm after. And I'm hoping that when I give it to you at first, you'll think, well, I don't know. And then as we begin to work through this issue of the background to Israel, by the time we're done, you'll think, okay, now I know what he means. All right, so here you go. My thesis. Israel came from people who valued mobility. I'll read it twice, but I'll try to read slow. Israel came from people who valued mobility, who incorporated long-distance herding as a key part of their sustenance, and who had links to groups north into Syria and south into Arabia. Okay? So this is my basic statement about ancient Israel's background. Right? I'll repeat it. Israel came from people who valued mobility. And I say this because this is not automatic. I mean, if you're, I don't know, the way we usually think about people from the past, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Babylon. I'm from Assyria, or whatever. Right? So right off, we're talking about people who are associated with movement. And the term that you might associate with that is nomads. But it's in some ways a misleading term. And I'll show you how as we go through class. So that's what I mean by that first statement. Right? Israel came from people who valued mobility. They're related to nomads, to people who move, not just people who are identified with a city or a town or village. Second part, who incorporated long-distance herding as a key part of their sustenance. So we're not talking about people who keep a few sheep in a pen out in the back. But there's a style of keeping flocks that involves moving them over long distances. You know, so you have to have almost a whole community on the move to take care of these sheep. Sounds nomadic again, right? But the thing I want you to focus on is that one part is the mobility itself. The other part is the shepherding, the herding. And both of these are aspects of ancient society that can be checked out outside the Bible. And so today we're going to look both outside the Bible and at the Bible. And then the last part was, so you got this, who incorporated long-distance herding as a key part of their sustenance. And the last part was, and who had links to groups north into Syria and south into Arabia. And this is to give a sense of what I see at least to be the likely origins of Israel among groups that have connections outside the region itself, that you're not going to explain Israel just by a kind of reshuffling of the deck of, everybody lives there now, and then they're going to, I don't know, their times change, they reorganize themselves, now they're Israel. And you'll see, you'll see the significance of that argument when you keep reading in Coogan's volume, especially when you get to Larry Steger's article, which is chapter 3, on the emergence of Israel. And he goes through various hypotheses about these origins and talks about, just from an archaeological point of view, about who lies in the background, how to see that. And you'll see that when I talk about it this way, this is not what everybody's saying nowadays about early Israel. See with me? You got my basic thesis? Yeah, go ahead.
You just repeat north into...
Yeah, okay, so north, who had links to groups north into Syria, meaning as far as Syria, like including Syria, and south into Arabia. So it's imagining that there are connections in Israel's background that point both north and south. And when I say Arabia, one of the interesting things about, if you call it the Near East, anybody ever heard the term the Fertile Crescent? So, I mean, I don't know how fertile it is or how much of a crescent it is or those things. But the big picture is that if you start from Iraq, just if you think of modern wars even, or political conflicts, and you start down from the Persian Gulf, if you call it that, or Arabian Gulf, depending on your point of view, and you work your way up the rivers, especially the Euphrates River, which comes down out of Turkey and then goes into Syria, works its way across. If you follow the Euphrates River up, then there is this area of Babylonia and so on that takes you up across Syria, and there were all sorts of ancient cities there. And it eventually gets you quite close to the Mediterranean Sea. And you're kind of just against the back of the Lebanese mountains. And so then you enter a kind of another domain that takes you down the Mediterranean coast toward Egypt. And again, there's a concentration of people, and as opposed to, say, desert. But meanwhile, this Fertile Crescent that wraps around, what it's wrapping around is the Arabian desert. Like if you just looked at a modern map, that's what's there, is what's now Saudi Arabia. And so what's interesting is you have the Fertile Crescent part where the big cities and civilizations are. But then there's a kind of a margin, like a sort of inside margin where you're on the edge of this Arabian desert, and there's a bunch of people associated with that area. And to some extent, Israel's also one of those, that it's not right on the Mediterranean, but it's right at that edge between the sea and all of its routes of communication and the desert. And so when you start talking about nomads and shepherds and stuff like that, then part of what you're dealing with are these people who move in and out of this kind of backcountry desert that's around Arabia and the kind of more fertile regions of the river valleys and the Mediterranean border regions. So this is what you should kind of picture. And so I'm saying that it appears that Israel, if you just go in fact, I'm depending on the biblical traditions for this in part, that the Bible reports, you could say, contacts both north and south in this kind of zone. Now, the question then, so the class will be divided into two parts. So I want to kind of walk you through how to frame the question of asking what are Israel's backgrounds. And then I want to turn to this letter that I had you read. And we're going to take a block of time in the second half of class to work through this. And I want to find out what you thought. I don't know what your reactions are. I mean, again, like when we get to Gilgamesh, for instance, for your first paper, then at least from my point of view, it's a pretty interesting story. It's got some interesting, colorful characters and situations in it. Some of this other evidence is, I don't know, they weren't writing it for you. It wasn't to try to win you over. In fact, in a way, if you look at how colorful this letter is, and I don't know how you reacted to it, but the guy who writes this letter is pretty aggressive. And his only audience is the guy he's insulting. And yet you could almost wonder if he was writing to somebody else, is he expecting that the people back home are going to see how tough he is, putting down this other king? But it's pretty colorful considering there isn't an audience. More colorful than Meremta was, at least. So we'll get to this. But I want you to think about the problem first. And so I've got the sort of general question. Maybe I'll ask you for suggestions, but walk us through this a little more quickly. But my question for myself even is, how can we find Israel's roots and look behind Israel in the land? How can we find Israel's roots and look behind Israel in the land? And what I mean by that is, I started us last time by looking at the earliest non-biblical evidence for Israel existing. I mean, even under that name. And in theory, I could have found evidence for Israel in a Mesopotamian text from northern Syria, and there it would be, and it would say, oh yeah, Israel, family associated with Jacob, let's see, father Isaac, grandfather Abraham, right? I mean, this is a stretch that you would actually find such evidence, but I'm saying that if it existed, then it's not as if the earliest evidence for Israel has to be in Israel. In fact, another possibility is we have lots of Egyptian evidence from what's called the New Kingdom, which is the period of Tutankhamun, King Tut, when Israel had, or Egypt rather, had an empire that extended all the way along the Mediterranean. They were at their richest and most powerful. There are a lot of texts from that period. We could find, evidence in Egypt for Israel in Egypt, right? Why not? The Bible says that there was this group of people called Israel in Egypt, but we don't. So the only old evidence we have, as you now know, is from an Egyptian text, but it puts Israel in Israel, right? In the actual land that they come to occupy. You with me so far? So then the question is, all right, the first evidence we have outside the Bible for Israel is already of Israel in the land. There they are. So if we want to ask, well, what is the background to Israel? Then we've got to we're also asking, how did they end up as this people in the land? And my question is, yeah, you have any ideas about how to answer this question? I mean, naturally I do. So don't worry if you don't have any ideas. But like just logically, what are you going to do? What's possible? Help me. You. Got an idea? How to answer the question? We'll let somebody else. So keep thinking. Help me. What do you know? You actually do know some things that you could apply. Yeah.
Maybe to cross-reference stuff from the Bible with archaeological.
Okay. So he's saying cross-reference stuff from the Bible maybe with archaeological evidence, right? So I mean, partly in terms of even things I've said the Bible's on the table, so you could have stuff from the Bible, at least ask what might work. And there's the category of archaeology. Yeah, go ahead.
For records of like Abram and Sarai in like Mesopotamian history.
So I mean, you could look for records from Mesopotamian history. Now the problem's going to end up being that none of these people are named. And so never mind Israel being named in these Mesopotamian records. None of the other characters are named. But even though characters aren't named, you could ask whether you could just learn more about the history and society and the lay of the land from such records. And absolutely, that's fair game. And biblical scholars and historians have tried it. Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't we say that there's not so much evidence from back then? So you're saying you can look it up?
Well,
you said you look it up and you said you could.
So what I'm saying is there is no evidence for Israel. Israel is not named in any of that evidence. There is no evidence for any of the characters in the Bible. So that won't do you any good. But if you ask the question more broadly, and you say, all right, Genesis portrays some guy, coming down from a place called Haran. Does Haran exist? Is that plausible that somebody might travel? Or if you did imagine that, what would be the framework? So that's the kind of question you can ask.
I was more going on, because your recitation kind of said that there's not so many sources or really anything to really go by from a certain time. There's not so much that we had. So I was wondering, are you saying there are stuff that we can look at in that time?
Yes.
Or there aren't?
There is. Yeah. So in fact, I mean, for instance, the archives of Mari alone, especially for this period, understanding the period that would be some hundreds of years before Israel is known to exist. This is an archive of 20,000 plus clay tablets in what's called cuneiform writing, and it includes maybe 4,000, 5,000 letters that are sent from people all over the world surrounding Mari itself. Mari itself is about 2 or 3 miles inside the Syrian border on the Euphrates River. So if you just pictured a modern map of the Middle East, then it's about halfway between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean. But they were connected to people all across the region in both directions, and so it's this marvelous, rich source for understanding history and politics and society in that time. And so just for one, its archives are a really rich source of information on what's going on in that time. And that is, to go back to the question in the back, right? That's a good place you can go to get a context, at least, for one looking at the biblical stuff. Now, to go back to your comment about archaeology, then, I mean, you could use archaeology in a broad sense. But one thing that archaeology gives you that this other set of information would not is the opportunity to look at evidence in the land. So one of the things you'd be doing with archaeology is asking, well, if I start with the land of Israel itself and look at what archaeology has produced, what excavation has produced, just a very quick explanation of archaeology. Archaeology involves at least two really different, though related, procedures, operations, strategies. One of them is excavation. It's what you associate with archaeology. You find some place where you hope you'll find cool things, and you start digging. And so, sure, absolutely, this is archaeology. But there's another aspect to archaeology which is extremely important, and which the average person probably doesn't know much about. And this is called survey. So what archaeologists will do is they'll just walk, they'll get a team, and they'll walk through a region. And they'll do it in stripes, so that, and literally, you can picture me here, yeah, next one over, about 20 yards, whatever, and it might be somewhat more than that, but they'll work their way through an area. Even very, very small villages would, the way they tended to make settlements in the old days was, rather than, sort of level the ground anytime you wanted to build a house or something like that, there tended to be a lot of continuity in where people lived. And so if you wanted to build a new house or rebuild a town or something like that, usually they built often with mud brick, which would get destroyed in the rain. And so they would just flatten the whole thing out and then rebuild from there with some combination of mud brick and stone. And so what happens when you build this way is that every time this happens, the ground gets a little higher. And so you end up with what's called a tell, which is a mound. And so even the largest cities, in fact, are higher than the land around them, just because they've been built on over and over again, even though with the large cities, sometimes you don't notice it. But with smaller towns and villages, it's really noticeable. Sometimes these mounds look like hills, but they're actually artificial. They were human-made. And so as these teams of surveying archaeologists work a given region, they're especially looking for these mounds, smaller, larger mounds. Then they walk across them. And the weird thing about the way these things work is that everybody used pottery for all sorts of daily life. I mean, you ate off it, you stored things in it, you carried things in it. It was a great everyday medium. You could have baskets made of reeds or things like that, but pottery didn't rot so much, and so pottery's great stuff. And the great thing about pottery is it doesn't rot. So even if it gets smashed and dumped and whatever, it's everywhere. And so as you imagine these mounds building up, then you should picture that there's crushed bits of pottery everywhere, sprinkled through these mounds, because people have been living there for hundreds or even thousands of years. And the weird thing about the way groundwater works is that as the rains go down and there's water that kind of circulates in the soil, then it has this weird sort of reverse, almost floating mechanism where pottery that's buried in the ground works its way up with the movement of water to the surface. Sounds strange? It's what actually happens. And so when you walk onto the surface of one of these tells, there's pottery, not just from the last people who lived there or that somebody dropped on the way out, but it's actually pottery from all the levels of the tell underneath that have gradually worked their way up to the surface. And so the great thing about that is that while it's not totally reliable, there's kind of a random effect of what actually turns up. But you can just pick up samples of pottery from the surface in this survey that represent different times. And so just by walking across without ever disturbing the tell with a shovel or a pick, you can get at least a rough sense of what times that mound had been occupied. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, this might sound like a dumb question. But,
Dumb questions can be the best questions, yeah?
You say, doing it without digging and
Yep.
disturbing it. So if water does that, is it possible to just, over time, use water instead of burning, making it so it kind of comes
Yeah.
without digging?
A new archaeological excavation technique. You do it with water. I don't know if anybody's ever thought of that. I think that it takes too long.
Probably.
Yeah, I think it takes too long. It'd be a nice way of getting more pottery without disturbing anything, right? It is true. One of the interesting things you say about archaeology is that archaeology is excavation is an act of destruction. So you better do it right. Number one, it means, as you go down, if you missed it, oh, I went through that wall. Oh, well, nobody else is ever going to see it. And, oh, yeah, there's a wall, but you never take record, you never take photos, you never draw pictures, or you don't collect things very well. Yeah, there was a wall, there was a building here. I have no idea what was in it. It didn't look very interesting, so we threw it in the trash. Well, I mean, it's kind of a judgment call because there's a lot of junk in a tell. So what do you keep and what do you, right? But you're the only one who's ever going to see it once you destroy it. So yeah, so this is all, it's good to think about that as part of the process. And unfortunately, it does have to be excavated down to get at it. Question?
I was just wondering, what is the exact reason that it comes up from the water?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to do with the way the water moves, the way the groundwater moves, that it actually, I wish I knew more about it. It's funny, actually, I was a geology major, so it's not totally foreign to me, but it can't be just then the potsherds per se, but that you think, oh, I'm standing on dirt, it doesn't move. But as water filters down from rain, and then there's sort of streams of groundwater, in the various layers as you move down, I mean, all that water is going somewhere. It's going down through the soil. And the interesting thing about what happens with the movement of that water down, and I suppose it's because it's displacing, as it goes, it's not just going through cracks, it turns stuff over in effect. So that as the water's going down to find gravity takes it down, then it's displacing bits of soil and pebbles and things like that rise as it's displaced down.
I think that those pieces are very small.
Not always. I mean, they can be,
Does that think the water displaces?
it won't displace old pot or something like that, but it will things that are like this.
It's a lot of water.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting, but it is actually true. But the reason for, part of this, I'm taking the opportunity just to give you a little feel for what is going on with archaeology. We're going to encounter people using archaeological evidence. But the important thing to catch here, to go back to the question of using archaeology, is that there's two sources of information. There's excavation of individual sites, and of course then there's a question of whether you know where you are. Does this place have a name or not? Is there any hope of knowing what that name was if you don't have any text? And so, that becomes an issue. Sometimes people can be sure about the name because it's like Damascus or something like that. It was a city 5,000 years ago, and it's a city today, and it appears to have kept its name through all of that time. And there are smaller towns where that can be said as well. Sometimes we don't know what the names are. So all you know is, well, I'm in a certain place. I can kind of follow what happened through time, at least in relative terms. And let's see what the evidence suggests. Were there people here? What were they doing? Were they rich? Were they poor? But meanwhile, keep in mind that the other source of evidence is survey. And this means that even if there was not time nor money or whatever to excavate everywhere, that you can get a rough sense of, say, all the people who lived in a certain area, like which sites were occupied by somebody, during what time, do you have a sense of how big they are? And survey can give you some of that evidence. Now, one last thing just to say is that I think it's your second paper, right? So there's two preparatory papers. The one that's focused on primary evidence, which is the Jonathan David Gilgamesh Enkidu paper. But your second paper is going to be on an argument that's developed in archaeology over what happened in, call it the 10th century, around the time of David and Solomon. And it was launched by a guy named Abraham Faust. And in some ways, the argument plays out, in part, over how much weight you can put on survey and evidence from survey, as opposed to evidence from excavation. So this issue is actually going to come up in a way that matters to you because it's going to be part of a paper. So we've got this possibility of going to archaeology. We've got the possibility of looking at biblical stuff. You've got the possibility of looking at texts from other places. They aren't going to give you Israel by name. They aren't going to give you characters from the Bible by name, but they might give you background in some sense. I had thought of one other direction to go. I'll just tell you, rather than fishing. You're doing a great job. Which is to look at Egypt in particular, because our first evidence from Egypt in particular, because our first reference comes from an Egyptian source. And it comes from a time when Egypt controlled the land that became Israel. And they say they were there and they defeated a people called Israel in that land. We don't know exactly where it is, but somewhere over here in what the term I'll use is the Levant, Levant, which is one of the more neutral words for the area along the coast of the Mediterranean, the sort of eastern coast of the Mediterranean. So in this Levant, the Egyptians had one part of their empire, and so it would be good to know whether the Egyptian evidence shows us anything for what happened before Merenptah, and it does. So in fact, that becomes worthwhile. So let me take just a few minutes and walk you through these categories, and then we'll turn to the letter from Mari. Okay? So I'm going to start with Merenptah. And again, remember, what did we have? We had a group that was a people, not a kind of city-based land. That was the marker that was attached to the name Israel. And the other, it was a people that Egypt could fight against and claim to have defeated. So it really had a political heft, you could say. Right? It was a body to be reckoned with. It's not just some kind of ethnic group or class or something like that. Now, the one other thing that I didn't perhaps emphasize as much as I could have, but that I want you to think about now in connection to Merenptah, is that Israel does not appear in earlier texts from Egypt. Now, in order to get there, there's one particular set of evidence from Egypt that I want you to be aware of, and I can't remember. I think that Pitard will talk about it in the second half of his chapter that we're going to get to. And this is a set of letters, another archive, much smaller than the one from Mari, but very important for our study of Israel, that's from a place called El Amarna. And the screen's down for one, and also I'm afraid to write on the whiteboard, certainly not with my marker, right? So I'll spell everything. So it's L-E-L-A-M-A-R-N-A, Amarna. And what this, have you ever heard of a guy named Akhenaten? I mean, you might have, because he's actually the first monotheist. Like if this ever came up, so I'll spell his name again for you. I really ought to be able to write. So Akhenaten, Akhenaten, Akhenaten. And this is this pharaoh of Egypt from the middle of the 14th century, sort of mid-1300s BCE, and he decided, there's only one God. We should destroy all of the images of other gods, and there shouldn't be any worship of other gods. And, you know, it sounds sort of familiar, except for it's Egyptian, and it's really, really old. But we're not even thinking about that. It turns out that at his capital in Egypt, which has the modern name El Amarna, they found a bunch of writing in the writing system of Mesopotamia, this cuneiform, C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, cuneiform, all right? So this is writing in imprinted wedges on clay. So they found the non-Egyptian writing. And among these were like 300 plus letters, and some of them were from places like Babylon and far, far away major powers. But the bulk of them were from the provinces that Egypt controlled in the Levant, term I just used, right? So all along the coast, from Syria, Lebanon, what became Israel, you call it Canaan. They sometimes called it Canaan. And so among these letters, for instance, are the first writing from Jerusalem. Like, we have letters from Jerusalem, the king of Jerusalem. You think, whoa, okay, that's worth knowing. When you ask, well, how about Abraham? Could we find Abraham in text? Well, I mean, no. Can you find Israel in text? Not till Meren Ptah. Can you find places in text? Well, yes. So, and this is the best place to look because we have, I mean, Jerusalem's famous, but there's a bunch of other places mentioned in the Bible as part of Israel, individual cities and stuff, that occur in these letters. There are letters that are sent from them. Go ahead, yeah.
What did you say that the Amarna was?
So El Amarna itself is the modern name of Akhenaten's capital. So Akhenaten, as part of his kind of program of change, which included one god only, he also built a new capital in Egypt. So it's in Egypt. These letters come from Egypt. Yeah, okay? So even though they were almost all sent from somewhere else, they were sent to Egypt. They were sent to the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And at least copies or whatever of them were collected in this archive. And just by good luck, they were found ages ago, back in the late 1800s. These things have been known since forever. So, interesting thing then, that because these letters represent really the correspondence of all of the main centers that were subordinate to Egypt in the Levant, then they provide a pretty good map of what the Levant looked like, what Egypt's, what would I say, what their empire looked like in this region. We have all sorts of different names, mostly of individual cities, but sometimes the little kingdoms that related to them. There are names for alliances and confederacies. Interesting, complex picture that a guy named Brendan Benz in our own department is writing a dissertation on. So Israel is not mentioned in this archive. Big fact, right? So about 1350, though it covers a generation maybe 20, 30, 40 years. But in this period, in the middle of the 14th century, there appears to be no Israel. Or if there was an Israel, it wasn't big enough or important enough to be relevant to Egypt. They didn't have to defeat it. They didn't have to exchange mail with them, write to them. None of the people who they did have as vassals and servants and provinces in this region ever complained about having to deal with the people of Israel as if they had conflict with them or maybe allied themselves with them. They're just off the radar. Likewise, there's nobody else. I mean, there's no Judah or, I mean, if you think of who some of the other characters, Ephraim, I mean, names of people in the Bible, not there. Just not there. So one place then to go for background to Israel is the Egyptian line of evidence, and to realize that something seems to have happened between 1350 and call it 1207. We don't know exactly what the date is for Meren Ptah, but it's pretty close to that. All right? Fact number one. Any question about that? Yeah. 1207 is, one of the thing is we know what year in Meren Ptah's reign that this text was written, but there's a little bit of disagreement among Egyptian specialists about how to line that up with our exact, chronology of years. So yeah, it seems to be probably within 5 years or something of then. Okay? So number one thing to know. So the second category that I wanted to look at was archaeology. And if you remember, I'll slow down and go through just a little more of this. So I'm watching the clock. I'll see if by 5 or 10 minutes I can get into the letter. So basic timetable. Again, this is stuff that should be in the history text. So if you want to get a little more context for it, that's the first place to go, right? But the big division as you draw out time periods archaeologically is between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age for the periods we're talking about. The Iron Age really is the age of Israel in this area. That's got other significance elsewhere. And then they break these down, right? So the Iron Age is usually divided into Iron 1 and Iron 2. We'll talk about some of that stuff later. But the key date to keep in mind for the Bronze and the Iron Ages is that the boundary to them had long been considered to be about 1200. So end of Bronze Age, start of Iron Age, 1200. It's been proposed recently that that's too high or too old, and that the boundary should actually be moved well down into the 12th century, into the second half of the 1100s, so between 1150 and 1100. That's still debated. I don't even know, I don't even have an opinion almost about how that'll come out, and I've read a lot of the literature. It's just not clear to me where that'll come out. But what I said at the end of the class with Merenptah is that it appears that, if anything, this reference to Israel in that Egyptian text is going to become ever more solidly embedded in the Bronze Age. So whether the boundary is at 1200 or a little, or 1150 or 1125 or whatever it's going to be, it's not going to be earlier than 1200. And even though it might be 1207 or 1209 or whatever it is, you can't fudge Merenptah and say, oh, it's kind of close. It really is part of the huge changes that produce Israel in the Iron Age. And if anything, what it shows is that Israel was part of the landscape when Egyptian power was dominant here. And if you want to figure out kind of the context for Israel, what it came out of, you got to be looking at the Bronze Age, not the Iron Age. And then the Iron Age tells you what happened as they get going. So the two big divisions to keep in mind then for the Bronze Age are going to be, this Bronze Age is usually divided into early, middle, and late. See Petard. Right? He will give you details and dates and things like that. But in general, if you think of 1200 or a little later as when you go into the Iron Age, then the Middle Bronze and the Late Bronze use up the rest of what you'd call the second millennium. So between 2000 and 1200 is going to be Middle Bronze and Late Bronze. And those are the periods that are going to be really important for getting a sense of the world into which Israel appeared. The Mari texts, things like that, are Middle Bronze. They're quite a bit earlier. The Amarna texts are Late Bronze. So between the two, it's 2000 to 1200. I didn't give you a date for the boundary between them, which is usually put, I think, at about 1550. But I mean, that's not as important. But that for the Middle Bronze and Late Bronze, you have combined, if you treat them as a block, then you'd have from 2000 to 1200. And to get together, people who are studying ancient Israel and trying to think about the background, the kind of context into which they emerged. And you think, 800 years, give me a break, that's a lot of background. But again, if you think, no, we know Israel appeared as such later on, but what was the society before then? And in fact, it looks like it was pretty consistent through those 800 years. And the area did really well in the earlier part and then went through this kind of gradual decline. And what's intriguing is that while the Egyptians were doing great, they were controlling the area in the second half of this period. So while the Egyptians controlled the area, the locals did worse. So gradually the area became poorer. They were better off when they were independent and ran their own show, which would have been more like the time of Mari. So it's the first half of this period, the Middle Bronze. But in fact, if you look, where are their cities? What cities are there? They tend to be the same places. The cities that existed in the earlier part of this period kept existing later. You lose a few of them when the Egyptians come and wipe them out, or something related to all of that disturbance. So you can work this out. What's going on based on archaeology for the time leading up to Israel. So this actually then leaves one more category, which you can probably guess. It came up already, which is the Bible. And the last thing I'm going to do before turning to this letter is to give you a thumbnail sketch of what I want you to notice about the Bible. And this would be the story of the book of Genesis. So again, you've heard me be very cautious about this biblical evidence. I'm not allowing us, in terms of evidence, just to treat the Bible as if it gave us the story, and now we just have to go find it in the archaeology. But at the same time, I want to treat the Bible seriously. If you have these complicated stories of Israel's background, are you going to imagine that it was just made up? Well, there are some people who go that direction, but to my mind and to the mind of my colleague Mark Smith here, both of us are convinced that biblical stories don't tend to appear that way. It's not like the whole thing's fabricated out of somebody's mind, but rather that you have these traditional stories that then have a history. And the stories can change, they can get combined, parts can get made up perhaps. You can debate such things. I'm not going to insist that you end up in one place on that. But we both here at NYU would see these stories, whether they're Genesis or elsewhere in the Bible's storyline, as having deep roots. And then the question is, well, what do they know and what can you check out? So in this case, Genesis has the story that goes farthest back. And if you say, all right, tell me the flood. Tell me, is the flood real? I'm going to say, go take another class. It's, or we can talk about it after class sometime. Because I've looked at this stuff carefully. But this is so far away, you can't really, it's a different category of question almost, how they saw the beginning of humanity and time. But when you get down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the large part of the book of Genesis is occupied with the story of some ancestors for the people of Israel that is told in very specific terms. And one of the things that characterizes this story is the sense that our ancestors, these people who represent the family that is the background to Israel, lived in a way that is absolutely foreign to us. Like the way people of Israel would have lived would be settled in the land of Israel, and they're farmers mostly, and they live in towns. They don't just move around whenever they want and wherever they want. And yet they say, oh yeah, ancestors, they moved around, and they had flocks. And so the way the story goes is it starts with this guy named Abraham. I hope I don't need to spell that, if only because you've heard of it as a name in modern settings. And his son, or preferred son, is finally named Isaac. Isaac has two twins named Esau, E-S-A-W-A-U, and Jacob. And the son Jacob ends up being identified as Israel. He even gets a sort of temporary name change, at least, so that you know that Jacob is Israel. And then Jacob has a bunch of sons, and those sons are identified as the tribes of Israel. And we're going to have a class on that in a couple of sessions, on this whole story of Jacob. But the interesting picture is that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of them are portrayed as shepherds. And all of them are portrayed as moving, as changing their base of operation at least once in their lives. And again, this is clearly, and I'll try to give you an example at the end of class, it's clearly regarded as a way of life that is different from the life of Israel as the people in the land. There's a sense that they were not like us, and that's something worth checking out historically. And in a way, then, that's my question for the whole biblical part when you say, well, check out the Bible against archaeology. Well, it's not going to help us to check out Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't know anything about them. It's not, we could look at certain places. Do these towns exist? Well, all right, but that doesn't really tell us, especially if the towns existed for 2,000 years, right on into later times. Then what good does it do if you have a place that existed at the end of Israel's existence? And yeah, it existed, 2,000 years earlier, but how do we know that the stories weren't just, late inventions? The question is, are there any details from the biblical stories that would only fit an earlier setting, and it might say something about Israel's origins, or are there aspects of the stories that might fit this? And in fact, I think it's possible. And my thesis statement all along has played to that. So if I go back to the thesis, Israel came from people who valued mobility. Well, that's what I'm saying about the Genesis story, right? That the Genesis story, for one, takes for granted the mobility of the ancestors of Israel. That the entire existence of Israel, as understood in the story of Genesis, requires even that they are mobile, and that's, for them, the explanation of how they got there. Now, this doesn't necessarily settle whether, what ancestors, who they were, where they came from exactly. But the way the Bible approaches it is assuming that they are not just local inhabitants of Canaan, if they called it that, who, sort of got together, decided to call themselves Israel. Hey, we should only worship this God. But it understands them to have come from outside because they were part of a kind of culture of travel, right? So then when I say that they come from people who valued mobility, who incorporated long-distance herding as a key part of their subsistence, that's also part of the Genesis story that I'm taking seriously as history. And then the last part is, and who had links to groups north into Syria and south into Arabia. Interesting thing is then that the stories in Genesis only look to the north, right? The connection for the stories in Genesis is with Syria, up into the north. And then the southern connections appear elsewhere in the Bible. It's a separate topic. So all of that said, Mari. By that meaning two things at once. So when Mari applied to our program, naturally my book that I'd written was still a fairly recent thing. And I tried not to make a big thing out of it. Like, it's not your fate to have to study the archives of Mari or anything like that, but the connection keeps coming up. I had a little section in my notes for going over some of the high points of Petard, but I think I've kind of larded them into what I've said already. But so if you haven't gone and looked at Petard's chapter, then go back and review. Like, just even read, what I had asked was that you read the first half for today's class. And I think that when you're trying to think, what did he mean by Middle Bronze and Late Bronze? And who are the people there? And what are the main sites? And what are the dates? And he's got a map, right? All this stuff. Like, just check it out for context. Now, here's the letter. So, I don't want a show of hands or something. Generally speaking, did you guys take a look? Okay, it's not hitting you cold. I have a couple of questions. So you can see this is letter introduction. Starts here. Speak to Yasmach Adu. Thus says Chami Ishtamar, your brother. It doesn't mean they're literal brothers. It's just a polite way of addressing somebody that you're going to treat as a social, political equal. In fact, both of these guys are kings, I said at the top, on a sort of small scale, kings of tribes. And this guy named Chami Ishtamar is writing to another king who he considers roughly his equal. It's not like a boss to a subordinate or something like that. So in this context, I have two questions. I'll put them both out there, and then we'll start with the first one. And then if you hang around, then we'll sort of scroll up and down. If people want to make reference to something in particular, we'll make sure it's up there. The first question is, do you believe what Chami Ishtamar says about himself and about Yasmach Adu? Did anybody catch that it's insulting? Okay. So, like, do you believe him? And in a way, I suppose, like, what's your basis for believing or not believing anything that he says? But I want to know, like, do you buy it? And what can you believe? Because if you can't believe anything that's said in any way, then I guess this isn't much help, right? It's just not going to help us figure out ancient society at all in the background of Israel. And then the second question is that I wanted you, or request, is that I want you to compare and contrast the lives of the two leaders. Compare and contrast the lives of the two leaders. Chami Ishtamar sets himself up as being totally different from Yasmachadu. Like, he does everything right, and Yasmachadu does everything wrong, and you wouldn't even know that they came from the same kind of culture, that they were both kings of similar sorts of people, and yet they are. So I want you to compare what you've got here. So go ahead, yeah. So say that again.
How do I say the second?
The second name, so it's going to be Chami Ishtamar. Say it, yeah, say it.
Hami Ishtamar
Excellent.
seems to be more nomadic.
Okay.
Criticize Yashma'adu for not being that way.
Okay, right, so major point to observe, absolutely, this is part of the line, at least in the letter, is that Chami Ishtamar says, I'm a real nomad. And did you remember what he says? Right. So on one hand, he's got this whole thing about you eat and drink, go to bed. Lolling in bed will not give you a good tan. I don't know. I mean, it actually does say something close to that and pretty literal. As for me, if I sit around inside just one day, my throat is choking. Right? So it's not even just that he is a nomad, but he says, like, this is our people. We're supposed to be doing this. We're supposed to be out there. Did you remember there was another part of the letter that had this nomad business? Do you remember what it was, or anybody? Later in the letter, this nomad thing would come up again. If you scroll down, right, all the way to the end. Let's see. Back up a little, Mari. Right. So up here, though, he says, "I have arrived to meet the Uprapu." That's his own tribe. And the other Binu Yamana, that's actually the kind of, like, if you imagine that the Uprapu, for instance, are like, what the Bible portrays as Judah or Ephraim or something, a tribe within Israel, then this Binu Yamana would be like Israel. That's the whole group. So as for you, you said, now Yansib Dagan will go with you in my place. When Yansib Dagan came with me, he turned out to be an old man. How is he supposed to go into the midst of the steppe? Will he collect one thing for you? Right, so this is the other kind of clue, that aside from that he says he's always going out into the back country and getting a tan, that he's now got some very particular purpose where they need to track down people from his tribe. And in order to track them down, it takes somebody to go out. In fact, in a way, there seems to be some kind of joint operation between these two kings that involves going out and tracking down the tribespeople who are not just in town. And yet then they send somebody who's not very travel rugged. And so he's saying, this is ridiculous. But you're right. This is the picture. Just put the other question out there. So accusation, he says he's a nomad. So sort of two questions. Do you buy that he's a nomad? What's he saying about himself and the other king? Like, is he saying, only I am a nomad, you are not a nomad? And how would you compare the two? Reactions? Surely you've all read it, so you can, what do you think? You can tell me. Give it a try, yeah.
I think Hamish more tends to think that he sort of had a harder life in the sense that he's had more to deal with. And so he's more knowing he's more worthy of the title of, the greatest.
Yeah, there is this kind of sense that Chami Ishtamar knows his way around. In fact, one of the things that may be true, although I'm trying to remember if we have enough background to be sure, is, Chami Ishtamar may actually be an older guy, not an old man like Yansib Dagan, evidently. But it may be that this guy, Yasmachadu, I think was his name, is new. I mean, he's a relatively new king. Yeah, you almost do get a sense of the difference in age. Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say, you just like Jan Dagen was an old man. He doesn't have to be technically an old man. He can just be making fun of him too.
No, that's a good point. I thought you were going to go another direction, which is the term for old man also refers to the elder, which can be kind of a position of respect. But clearly, he is making fun of him and saying he's not really ready to travel out there. But absolutely,
He's older than the other guy, and he's saying, this guy's
Yeah.
an old man to me.
Yeah, that's right. But he's
making
decrepit.
everyone.
Yeah. So it's not, for one of the things I want you to do as you read this letter is to apply this to the way you read everything as you go, and unfortunately, maybe even the Bible, which is don't just trust everything they're saying. Or it may be true for them in some way, but they've got an axe to grind, and this is true of biblical writing as well, that they've got an axe to grind. And so just listen. Go ahead.
Is there a response?
We don't have any evidence of the response. Would have been great to have one, except for it probably was unprintable. It was not worthy of a response. One of the questions you might ask is why we even have this letter, because neither one of these characters is from Mari. And so at some level it appears this is intercepted correspondence, that this got picked up somehow by somebody connected to Mari and sent to the king of Mari saying, well, you'll want to know what these guys are talking about to each other. Because the king of Mari actually comes up in the end now, pay attention to this tablet of mine, and if the king delays going on campaign, get me silver, clothing, everything else you can put your hands on, and now that I myself am here, send it on to me. It sounds like both of them are accountable to take part in some sort of campaign of the king, which is going to be Zimri Lim of Mari. And so there's a connection, but it's quite interesting that the letter even exists, or that we have it. Go ahead.
I understood in the beginning of the letter the connection to the nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah.
And then I thought the last paragraph, to me, that seemed a little bit suddenly permanent. Like,
Yeah.
it was almost like establishing, I don't know, it's not even saying all the tablets and the silver and the clothing.
Yeah.
And anything else and sending it somewhere. That's a lot of stuff to be carrying around. It seems like they're settling somewhere.
Yeah, well, or I mean, if you're picturing like how do these people live, then you think, oh, I mean, they've got silver, they've got all the. I've talked a little bit about scribes and scribalism as a kind of technical profession, and as we start to read Carl van der Toorn, and you see, what that involves, it's like a staff of engineers or something like that. That these nomads are not having a rudimentary existence; they're exchanging mail using the latest technology. Imagine the. Let's see, are we using Apple or are we using PC? That they're up on all the latest. And so build that into your picture. What else do you see in the letter that suggests a settled aspect? That's something I really want you to pick up. So yeah, you get the nomadic ideal. At least Chami Ishtamar says, I live this way. And I guess the thing I want you to catch is that he's implying you, Yasmachadu, ought to be living this way too. So at some level, in a way, Chami Ishtamar is implying that they both belong to peoples who ought to share this way of life. So there's a nomadic kind of ideal. And yet, as you read through the actual letter, there are various references to things that don't sound nomadic. So for one, you start at the end, and you've got the silver, the clothing, the tablets, and all of this. What else do you see? Go ahead.
He says, I've never piled up stores from the grain or harvest that I always made, and that's not a nomadic.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it, right? So I've never piled up grain. What were you going to say? Similar thing, right? So absolutely, really important to pick this up. That grain farming, right? So you could say, well, they just bought it all. Well, I don't know. Well, if they bought it, but they're storing it, this is not just farming, but it's sort of complicated institutional arrangement where you're keeping warehouses for this stuff, or some kind of system for storing this up at a level that would even be noticed by kings, because remember, these two are kings of fairly extensive peoples. Doesn't sound so nomadic, or at least, and yet they're talking about, you can't deny the mobile part, because right in the very same paragraph, he's saying, I've arrived to meet my tribe and the other people from our tribes, And as for you, you said, Yanzib Dagon will go with you in my place, because it's assumed that you got to go out and round up, the people who are not immediately available. And it even calls this the steppe. Now he is supposed to go into the midst of the steppe. That's down at the bottom. And the steppe would be a word for that, really desert, kind of. This is an area that would not be associated with towns. And so there's this mix. What else do you see? There's at least one other category of information that has to do with settled life, something that doesn't seem nomadic. Yeah?
Well, there obviously has to be some sort of home base if Yasma Adu is not leaving his house.
Yeah. Okay, so for one, the whole insult builds around this notion that his tribe has some kind of meeting, and Yasma Adu refuses even to leave his home base. And instead, he just sends funds and sends his opinion. And Chami Ishtamar says, look, you're not going to nobody's going to agree with you if you don't show up. Absolutely, it's got a home base. It even tells you its name, which, if I remember, Mari, if you back up a little, was called Chen, up there at the top there. Yesterday, all your tribe assembled at Chen. So this, actually, it's not the home base. Just my mistake. We don't know the name of his home base, but we know that there is a settled place called Chen where they all go. So there's at least his home base and that. But we do know the home base of Chami Ishtamar. Did you catch that? Do you see it? This place called Achuna in the third paragraph on the screen. Look at me. Unfortunately, it's pretty broken here. I escaped death. And from the midst of the town of Achuna, I escaped 10 times during uprisings. He seems to have problems with his home base. But he's talking about a town. This is evidently, this sort of place that he's got to use as a base of operations. He's got to work with the people at that base, except for, in a way, he's saying, yeah, but I've got such good ties with the rest of my tribe out in other places, I can get in and out and get away with it. But indirectly, Chami Ishtamar is acknowledging that there are settled bases, at least, that are part of his kingdom as well. So we've got 5 minutes left, but this is really what I wanted you to see in this letter. So on one hand, if I went to the whole cuneiform literature in Mesopotamia and Syria, this letter is probably as good a place to go as any place to get a vivid picture of a life that valued mobility. And that, in fact, if you look at other texts, is absolutely based on herding sheep and goats. And you can see how the writer even lays claim to this heritage and says, yeah, we are nomad people. Any king from this people ought to be out there in the backcountry, ought to be out there in the desert, in the steppe, visiting the people with the flocks. That's the only way you're going to keep them behind you. It's the only way they're going to be identified with you. In this mindset. And yet at the same time, they've got wealth, they've got farming, they've got towns. It's all part of one mixed system. And the more stuff from Mari you read, the more you see all the parts of that system. How in some ways it looks just the same as the cities. They've got scribes, they've got piles of grain, they've got wealth, they've got kings, they've even got institutions, administration. And yet, built into this, they've got these herds of sheep and goats moving at long distances with whole communities of people who are responsible for those. And in order to keep contact with those communities, you have to either go out yourself or send messengers. It's part of the essential way in which this society works. And by some fluke, we can get into it sometime, but it's very, very interesting that the archives of Mari preserve this. And it's partly because the king of Mari turns out to have been a kind of tribal king himself. And so he was really rooted. He was just like these two guys, in a way. A little more removed, a little more settled, but he was really kind of tapped into that world. And so in a way that we don't usually get from other archives from this part of the ancient world, the archives from Mari give us a view into a world that was probably more like the world of the people that came to be Israel. And the reason that I'd give for being able to get away with that statement is that the book of Genesis, when it tells the story of who are our ancestors, They give you elements that are not part of their own current life. The people are mobile, they travel long distances, and yet they settle around towns for long periods of time. Their wealth is based on sheep or goats or herds. And finally, I guess you'd say, they organize themselves by family. What is the entire story of Genesis telling you? We'll come back to this. It's that the people of Israel are a family. They're organized by kinship. And this, again, a little bit longer story, is characteristic of tribes. In fact, if you wanted to define tribes, then one of the most important elements would be that they see their relationship by kinship, by family ties. And one of the things that allows tribal people to do is to create bonds that are not just defined by where you live. Because if you're joined as family, then there can be somebody in another city over there or out in the country a couple hundred miles off somewhere else, and yet you can consider yourself related to them because you've got these ideas of family ties, whether they're real or not. Okay? Now the last, almost out of time. Very quickly, what you should do, go home, 2 chapters you should read. This would be a good thing to do in the section. I'm not telling you should. Genesis chapter 37, story of Joseph, beginning of the story of Joseph. Genesis chapter 37. Second text, chapter 16 of the first book of Samuel. 1 Samuel chapter 16. The beginning of the story of David. They're both shepherd stories. And in them, in the first one, Joseph, youngest brother, goes off to find all his brothers with the sheep. He travels what might be like over 100 miles north from where his family lives to go find all his brothers who are out with the sheep. David, when the prophet Samuel comes to him to anoint a new king of Israel, and they say, oh, David's out with the sheep. Who's David? David's the youngest brother. Like it's the exact opposite of Joseph. And they just run out. Oh, well, he's not right here, but we'll get him and bring him back. It doesn't say how long, but it's the same day. They go out and get him and bring him back. He's out alone with the sheep. Something has changed. And what I want to, when I told you that it's not our life, David's story represents what sheep would be in Israel. They're out there nearby. Joseph's story is told, however old the story may be, as just a completely different role for sheep and shepherds. So that's the sort of contrast I wanted you to see. All right. See you Monday.